So first, thank you so much for joining us. It's really an honor to have you here for this webinar. This is such an in vogue topic because right now communication and positioning, brand positioning really is key as we're all distant, like we're all in our own, areas. So Richard, for those who don't know, he's an expert when it comes to PR and branding. He is an entrepreneur. He's the CEO of Fifth Avenue Brands, a New York-based PR firm. He speaks in many different places on entrepreneurship, foreign policy, economy, and so many different things. He has been called an entrepreneur to watch by more than one magazine. And anyway, there are so many different things that we could use to describe you, but I think these things are going to come up as we develop conversation. But if you have anything to add, please go ahead.
Sure. Well, thanks, Miriam. Yeah, I'm excited to be here today. I'm excited for the conversation and to also hear from questions that some viewers might have. Fifth Avenue Brands, we're a PR firm based in New York City, like you mentioned, and we serve primarily clients in the financial industry, in policy, and also in technology, helping them put together their communication strategy. And our core business is media relations, so we spend a lot of time working with the press.
So you guys know us.
Yes, we do.
Now, Richard, one thing that that I've been seeing, I used to work in branding, so that's my base before journalism. And one thing that I see that we have a lot of questions, the journalists as people, is there is something called a personal brand as a journalist, separated from the outlet brand. So I think we could counterpoint what are things that we should look out as journalists, as individual journalists, and then as people who are representing somehow a bigger brand.
Yeah. Well, look, we live in an era where branding has become important, not just for corporate brands, but also for individuals, including journalists, because people, consumers, they want to connect with a brand that is in many ways personable and relatable for them. So whether you're a company, whether you're an artist, whether you're a journalist or an activist, having a personal brand identity and knowing how to position that and use it so that you can connect with your audience and cultivate relationships and engage with them, that's become really important, especially in the digital age, for getting your work recognized. So the key thing to know there is that branding isn't just for corporations anymore. And whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're a public figure, or whether you're somebody who works for a corporation, taking steps to build that personal brand and create an authentic presence online where you can connect with people is really important for whether it's advancing your career, getting your work recognized, or for building your own business, or just building the reach of your content as a reporter. So it's becoming very important.
I'm curious, out of the people watching here, how many of you are aware of having a personal brand as journalists? Comment on the chat, just to be like me, or never thought about it, always represented an outlet. Because a lot of the times as journalists, especially when you work for a larger outlet, you feel very secure to be like, I am so-and-so from the New York Times, or like I work with Harper's Bazaar. So it's a status, when I go into a press conference, it's like Miriam Spritzer from Harper's Bazaar. So it's separate what the audience expect from me as the people that follow me on Instagram and Twitter and whatnot. They don't want to see just the outlet that I represent. So what would be tips and advices that you could give for journalists to be a little bit more aware of that personal, like how to position themselves as a personal brand?
So what's interesting is, even for those who haven't thought about it this way before, who haven't, maybe they haven't necessarily thought of themselves as a personal brand, maybe they work for a large news organization. In the digital age, whether you've been proactive about it yet or not, everybody does have a personal brand, because you can go to Google and you can search for somebody, and those results that come up are going to influence how people engage with your content, how they interact with you. And as a PR agency, a lot of the work that we do is interacting with reporters, and oftentimes we do Google reporters and search for them and kind of get a better feel for what they're writing about, what their interests are, the content they're creating on social media. So it's important. And for the people who haven't really paid attention to it before, a lot of times you already do have a personal brand, and it's a good idea to start taking steps to building that. So how do you do that? Number one would be content creation, right? Do a Google search for yourself online and see what comes up, and look at how you could be optimizing your social media presence, how you could be optimizing your presence on various platforms, whether it's somewhere like Medium that you might write articles for, or LinkedIn that you might publish your own content on. But look at how your content's being represented online, and look at how you can create an omnipresent brand identity for yourself so that you are visible on as many platforms as possible. And when somebody Googles you, they're seeing an accurate representation of what your brand, what you want your brand to be identified with.
Now, one thing that often comes in conversations with, especially journalists, is social media an absolute now? Like, is there, because nowadays when we talk even about being hired for different jobs, is the first thing they look is your social media presence in whatever medium, like platform it is. But a lot of people argue that that's not necessarily important for journalists. What is your view as someone that comes from the PR and branding world? Mm-hmm. As far as is social media something inevitable that now we should all be thinking about Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and
mm-hmm. Well, so I would say two things. I would say, number one is that when somebody searches for you online, social media platforms are usually the first place that they're going. So having some kind of a presence there does create value for being able to reach a larger audience and being able to get your work recognized by more people. At the same time, from a journalist perspective, there are also a lot of uses for social media, whether it's using Twitter to be able to identify sources or to research stories or to find stories. There are a lot of other uses that social media can play a role in that would be really valuable for a reporter to be a part of. I know Twitter is usually the most popular social platform that reporters like to use because it's great for following conversations, it's great for following news, and it's great for interacting with people who aren't necessarily a part of your circle. But having a presence on various social media platforms is important for being able to kind of influence the Google search results that come up about you when somebody searches for you. And I would suspect that a lot of times when it's somebody is searching for you online, they're not just Googling the place that you work for, but they're also searching your personal presence as well. So it's something important to pay attention to. And as far as platforms go, I would argue that it's not even as important which platform that you're on. It's making sure that you have omnipresence on multiple platforms, and platforms come and go. Yeah. But it's about building that audience who can follow you from platform to platform. Because today it's Instagram and it's becoming TikTok, but it might not be tomorrow. What's more important is that you're creating a presence that generates a following for your personal brand. Mm-hmm. That whether tomorrow is Twitter or Facebook or something that we don't even know about yet, that audience is going to continue to follow you and engage with your content.
And that's something important to highlight, because when we talk about social media, I don't know if you guys remember this, but MySpace was huge before there was Facebook.
Yep.
In Latin America, Orkut was the big social media. Then Facebook came in, and then everybody was on Facebook. Then Instagram came, and Facebook actually bought Instagram. And then it was threatened by Snapchat. And then when Instagram literally copied the what Snapchat created, the short videos, the stories, then Snapchat lost market. So it's really impossible to know which social media is going to be the key one. Doreen is asking, how do you actually go about changing your social media presence? That's a very good but very big question.
Yep. So speaking broadly, I would say number one is doing a review on all the different platforms that you currently have a presence on. So look at, do you have a Twitter profile? Do you have an Instagram profile? look at everywhere where you have a presence, and then expand that to also include the platforms that you want to add to that you also want to have a presence on. So that would be number one, is where do I want to have that presence? Maybe it's Twitter, maybe it's Instagram. You want to have at least a few of them where you're building a presence. And then you want to look at each of those platforms and look at the content that performs well on those particular platforms. For example, on Twitter is a very conversational platform. A lot of the content is oriented around news and talking about trending topics. So it's a great place to engage in conversations with people about current events and to share content that you're writing. Instagram, on the other hand, is a very visual content focused platform where it's more about sharing great visual content. So you want to make sure that you can create some kind of visual content that goes along with stories that you might be sharing or information about your brand that you might be sharing to be able to get more attention on that platform. So identifying those platforms you want to be on, figuring out the types of content that perform best on those platforms, and then creating a strategy that will allow you to generate that content regularly is the way that you want to start, because you want to be active on most platforms at least every week, if not every day, to make sure that you're getting in front of the audience that you want to get in front of and getting the right reach for your work. So that's kind of a basic overview, but that's where I would start without knowing a lot about maybe specific objectives that you might have. But really, creating content and just starting it is the key thing. Create content, create a presence, and take advantage of different platforms. Like I said, you never know which platform is going to be here tomorrow. It's about taking advantage of all of them to build an audience that you can take with you wherever you want to go next, whichever platform rises up next. And if you do that, that builds it kind of builds a core value base for your brand that you can get a return from, whether you're on Twitter or whether you're on Instagram or somewhere else.
Now, I'm going to move to a harder set of questions, because I think this is the topic. It's how to communicate during difficult times. And I think this is particularly a more difficult time because in addition to everything that's going on as far as political crisis, pandemic, and whatnot, there is a new thing that we call the cancellation culture, that anything you say, anything you publish will and can be used against you. And like, to the point that I don't know how many of you have heard about cancellation culture, of like when people get canceled in the public eye. So I wanted to go over a little bit of what do you see as a strategist, because that's really what you do. When you look at this scenario, what are the things that are like, these are the hot things that we have to be in the lookout for?
So it's a big topic. Cancellation culture, just to zoom out a little bit, is basically, a celebrity or a brand or a public figure says something that's controversial. So there's a general movement, usually on social media, to try to cancel this person. In other words, try to boycott their products or not follow them on social media, not engage with their content. And it's something that's become very prevalent over the last few years. And it's definitely something that is giving especially a lot of brands, pause before they create content online about what kind of repercussions it's going to have in terms of how it's perceived. A perfect example of that would be just this morning. I don't know, Miriam, if you saw the headlines around Goya. Goya Foods, their CEO, was at the White House, and he made some statements that were positive about President Trump, and there was a lot of backlash on the left about canceling Goya and boycotting their products. And obviously right now it's really not going over well for them. So this culture that we're seeing does give a lot of brands and honestly just public figures and personal brands a lot of pause about how they're communicating online to ensure that they're not doing any kind of damage. So from a strategy perspective, what do we tell clients is we still bring it back to the core fundamentals of how you build a brand in 2020. And that's changed a lot. What we tell our clients is, number one, is authenticity. You need to be authentic in your brand identity and the content that you're putting out. And if you're doing that, that means that a lot of your content is going to be consistent with your values. We don't tell people what to believe or what's right, what's wrong. You have to be
Yeah.
right or you have to be left. But what's important is that you identify what your values are, and that the content you're putting out there and your brand identity is authentic with that.
And just to highlight as a counterpoint to Estee Lauder recently went through the same thing as Goya a couple of weeks ago, but now people forgot about it. So it's important to point out that not necessarily the cancellation thing happens for long term. Sometimes it's a hit for a week and then things kind of fall into place. Because with Estee Lauder, I don't know if you saw this case specifically, but they were same thing. The left started criticizing the chairman of the group Estee Lauder because he supported Trump, and basically the company decided not really to do much about it because most of the board was a lot of them were Trump supporters, especially when it came to the taxing plans and whatnot. So, and this was 2 weeks ago. Today, we don't even remember it.
Yep. Yeah. So there's two sides of it. Number one is that you want to be authentic. You want your values to come through in the content that you're creating. And if you're doing that right, obviously you need to be able to, it's more important in 2020 than ever for brands to be able to do the right thing. That's what consumers are looking for. It's more important to consumers, especially millennials and now even especially Gen Z, that they associate themselves with brands or with personal brands, public figures, that they feel have values that align with theirs. So creating that authentic content is what consumers and your audience is looking for. But at the same time, you, of course, have to be ready for any kind of criticism, because not everybody has the same beliefs as you and the same values. You need to be prepared. If you're going to put that content out there, you need to be prepared for some of the criticism that's going to come with that. You correctly pointed out that, not all of that criticism lasts forever and does permanent damage. Of course, that doesn't mean that you should be reckless and say something that is going to be inflammatory and offend a lot of people just because you think it will blow over quickly. But not everything that you put out is going to do permanent damage to your brand. The important thing is that you're doing what you believe is right and what's aligned with your values. And if you do that, for the most part, what we've seen working with hundreds of brands over the years, is that if you're authentic and you share your values and what you believe, you're always going to find what we call your tribe, right? So you're going to probably offend, no matter what you say in 2020, you're going to offend some people. But you're also going to find the people who share those values and believe in what you believe. And you're going to build an even bigger, what we would call in branding, kind of like a cult following, right? Like brands like Apple have this cult following where people are extremely loyal to that brand. Sharing that authentic content is one of the most effective ways of being able to do that. So know what you believe, know what you want to take a stand on. It's important for brands to take a stand, be authentic in putting out content that's aligned with that. And know that, if you're doing the right thing, you're going to find your tribe who aligns with it, but you're going to take some criticism along the way too, which sometimes is bad for business, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes consumers are looking for brands that stand up for the right thing.
Now, going back to, it's in theory, that's great. Like we all know in theory, that's great, but it's very hard to actually do it in reality. Yep. So we're living at a moment that there are so many hot topics, like never in history. I think there were so many topics that could get you as a brand canceled or criticized, or, as you said, you're going to offend someone somehow, no matter what you do. And you're not going to please everyone. And so there are so many different things. And also now with the pandemic, we've seen that the facts change every 5 minutes. Like, so I want to go back to the branding as journalists, because all of a sudden, if I support a theory, that theory can be changed scientifically based in 5 minutes. So my question would be, what is the best way to, as a personal brand, as a journalist brand, to position myself in this moment that we have no ground really, because there is no way to even be that secure that you are behind the right path or, behind the right mission, vision.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, the challenge of this is that what we've seen is the first rule, you need to keep communicating. And that's the hardest part, right? Because we are in this period where facts are changing constantly, and public sentiment and the climate is changing constantly. And it gives a lot of brands and journalists and public figures pause about, do I really want to get out there in front of this? Maybe I should let it play out. Mm-hmm. But the first rule is you need to keep communicating. There was even a study that was done, Media Global, I think it was Media Frenzy Global, did a study recently of consumers around the world about the impact that COVID had on how they perceive brands and public figures. Yeah. And they found that it was something about a third of consumers were more unlikely to do business with a brand or with somebody in the future if they hadn't consistently communicated during the COVID crisis. So kind of stepping back and staying quiet while the dust settles isn't an option either. You need to figure out a way where, obviously everybody is trying to put out content that's as accurate as possible. But the nature of the situation is that these things do change very quickly, and you need to be able to react proactively and rapidly to be able to update your content and update your followers as things change and more information unfolds. So that combination of communicating consistently and frequently, while also being rapidly proactive about updating when things change, is honestly, it's really the best thing that you can do, because stepping back is not an option in a climate like this. When people are craving, whether it's from a brand or from the media, people are craving transparency. They're craving responsiveness and proactiveness. So you need to be able to find a way to still participate in that conversation while being as transparent as possible. And for the players who are being transparent, it does come through. So, you need to do the best that you can to be able to provide that information and update people accurately without taking a step back that could damage perception among your audience.
Now, I wanted to go over like a few, considering all these challenges that we're facing. Which companies have you seen? Because I want to go back to like the beginning of the pandemic when nobody knew what was happening and then with the political crisis and Black Lives Matters and all these other things that happened. Which companies do you think, or companies or brands, when I say companies, like brands, whether personal brands or companies, that have done well, and why did they do well? Like when you look back at their strategies, like this person or this company really positioned themselves well regarding to what they believe and how they are, and then going into, why do you think that they did so well? Sure.
So I would, first off, I would say Wendy's Twitter is an interesting example to look at for more reasons than one. Wendy's, their Twitter account is actually pretty popular among the branding community. It's a good example of a brand that does things right. They've created a brand identity that's very personable and relatable. They reach out and engage with people. And during the COVID crisis, they were doing just that. They were being very proactive about reaching out and communicating with customers about what was going on. The companies that we've seen do the best have focused on communicating frequently and proactively by providing information and updates rather than trying to sell a brand or to sell a product or features. So it doesn't matter whether, you're in the food industry like Wendy's or, maybe you're in the car business like Ford or whatever you might sell or whatever your vertical might be. Being able to convert your brand identity from not just selling a product, but to also, in many respects, being a media company. And being able to provide customers and your audience with accurate and up-to-date information that provides value for them rather than just selling, is something that really resonates with readers, with consumers. And that's something that anybody can do, whether you sell cars or whether you're a reporter or, whether you're Wendy's. You can provide information for customers about how to stay safe and what you're doing. The second thing that we saw a lot of successful companies do during the height of the pandemic was kind of just communicating with employees and communicating with partners and being transparent with them about what the path forward is going to look like. There are a lot of employees who didn't know what was going on that worked for major companies at the height of this, didn't know if their job was safe or, you know, what the future of their workplace was going to look like. So the brands who won were the brands who were communicating proactively, not just about adapting their product message to the crisis, but trying to be an actual valuable source of information to help people to get through this. I can give you another example. One of our clients is a private equity fund, and one of the areas that they invest in is they own lots of student housing complexes across America, serving lots of different universities. And they ran a really successful media campaign during the pandemic focusing on safety. Number one, they made sure that the tenants who were living in their developments were safe. So they provided masks and cleaning equipment, and they provided emergency response information for their tenants to make sure that everybody was educated on what was going on and how they could stay safe. They donated a lot of masks and PPE to local first responders and local healthcare workers. So they focused on that safety first, and obviously they communicated through that what they were doing. And then they shifted their focus to providing thought leadership for the industry, which got them a lot of exposure in the media, providing valuable analysis about how COVID was impacting student housing and the well-being of their students and what the plans would be moving forward, especially for the school year in the fall, how they were going to keep students safe if classes reopened. So the common thread through all of that is really focusing on how do I adapt my messaging to providing information that helps people and keeps them safe, and not just adapting my sales message to the current climate, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Now, there are a couple of questions here that have to do with the previous topic we were talking about. So about the cancellation and whatnot. So Shamsun says, in like India, Bangladesh is also tough to do personal branding. All are shadowed by organization. What can we do? So when the organization that you work for does not allow you to shine brighter than the organization, what can a journalist or employee do to, in any case, still have somewhat of a personal brand?
Well, it's definitely tough. And I can even say that for us, you know, we have clients in, for example, the financial industry, which is really highly regulated, investment firms, brokerage firms, where there are a lot of rules around what individual employees can put out in terms of content, what they can promote. So, you know, what I would say is, you know, first, if you're a journalist, a lot of your personal branding can be done through the stories that you write and the content that you create. So focusing on the strength of your content and how you're distributing it through social media in a way that's compliant with your organization is one way that you can focus on building a brand, even though you may not have a lot of creative liberty in terms of creating TikTok videos or you know, doing Instagram lives or media appearances, speaking engagements, that kind of thing. Making sure that you're putting together a personal distribution plan for your content that distributes it and gets more reach. And you know, I don't know so much about Bangladesh, but I know that a lot of news organizations here in the US actually see a lot of value in having their employees be able to get even more distribution on their content through their personal social media. And that's kind of a selling point for a lot of reporters that work for bigger news organizations. As an employee of a corporate brand, it becomes a lot more, definitely becomes a lot more challenging. You know, you have to find a way to create a content strategy that's compliant with your company's policies, and every company's policies are different. But there are, I would say, you know, there are a myriad of channels out there on the internet that you should be able to find something that is congruent with those corporate policies, whether it's, you know, maybe you're writing something for a company newsletter, or maybe there is a limited scope of what you can do on social media that will allow you to create more content that builds your brand identity, or whether it's participating in more dialogue on LinkedIn and building up a LinkedIn presence. You kind of have to figure out what works for your company's specific policies. And a lot of times when we work with financial firms, what we'll do is have a meeting with their compliance department, who oversees a lot of that stuff, and look at how specifically we can elevate the personal leadership of some of the employees in the organization and get them more exposure in a way that is compliant. But no doubt it is challenging, and you need to find something that aligns with your company's particular policies. Thanks to all the channels that are available, there usually are strategies that you can figure out that do
there are
work.
ways to go about it.
Yeah.
Now, another question has to do with what we were talking about, the offending people and,
Yep.
the cancellation culture. Do you think companies or anyone with a relevant profile on social media should reply the hateful comments or the negative comments? Like if one of your PR clients get involved with gossip, cancellation, bullying, etc., do you recommend that immediate the actual individual response to each post, or just like a standard response to all of them?
So what we do normally, what you want to do is you want to make sure that your stances are clear and being authentically communicated. Whether it's picking out one comment, a lot of times what brands do now is they'll pick out one select comment that they want to respond to, and they'll put their position there. And they'll follow that up with some content of their own that they create on social media that makes their position clear. But at the same time, it's not necessarily, especially if you're a brand that has tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of followers, it's not really necessary that you reply to every single comment. You want to make your position clear, and you want to communicate that authentically, but you don't necessarily need to reach out to because some of them are trolls, some of them are bots. You don't really need to respond. Sometimes you'll give more attention to those comments than they would get if you had just kind of left it alone. So make your position clear, but don't feel the need to kind of address every single person who's responding.
Because one example of that I kept seeing the last couple of weeks online was Leah Michelle, the actress from Glee. I don't know if you guys were familiar with what happened, that she posted something in pro of the Black Lives Matter movement, and all of a sudden she was literally canceled by all of her colleagues and whatnot. So she reacted in a way that maybe made her situation worse than what it could have been, because I think she did reply the messages. And so it's just like it's a hard decision to make on to either answer it or stay quiet about it. It's
tough. Every situation is different, and some of this depends on your brand and who you're interacting with. But what's important again is making your stance clear. But kind of it's not always best to then go and litigate it with 35,000 people in the comment section. A lot of times that will do more damage than good. And like I said, you're bringing a lot more attention to some of these opposing views that maybe wouldn't have gotten that much attention if you had just made your stance clear and then moved on. So I would say lead with your actions, create content, and beyond creating content as a brand, do things that are actually making a difference to support that cause. And that's the most important thing you could be doing.
Now, we talked about companies that really dealt well with all the challenges in this crazy scenario. What were companies or brands that failed miserably? Because I always think that one of the best ways to learn is when you look at why did you do this? So I don't know if you were aware of any companies or brands that failed miserably, but I'd be curious to see what you have to say about that.
So I would say there are a lot of companies that under-communicated, and that was probably the majority of what we saw that was bad. I would say that, number one, from a business standpoint, if you were under-communicating during COVID, if nothing else, you were missing an opportunity because
everybody was watching.
Everybody was online. No matter what study you look at, the increases in social media consumption, online content consumption were huge. And if you were under-communicating, it did change the perception that a lot of consumers had of your brand. So beyond that, we can call that, kind of just mistakes through under-communicating. There are definitely some brands out there who didn't handle it as well as others, and some of them it was their fault. Some of them it was just bad timing. For example, Corona. I think Corona launched I think it was a hard seltzer line sometime in late February, right as everything was like kind of, everything was starting to go crazy and things were shutting down. And it kind of gave the impression that they were promoting spring break and gatherings and all these kinds of things at a time when social distancing was extremely important and everything was shutting down. And that was kind of a bad look for them. And they got some bad publicity for that. But at the same time, it's kind of one of those things that it was bad, unfortunate timing for them. It was probably a launch that was planned 2 years in advance, and it was just unfortunate timing that it's very difficult to change the timeline on that kind of thing once the wheels are set in motion.
And it is a shame because they could have made so many creative choices, even with the name of the virus towards the beer. Like there were so many publicity things that they could have done with it, and it's So you have the companies that unfortunately made errors that were due to unfortunate timing, which was a lot of them. And then there definitely were some players out there who we could call unforced errors. Like if you look at the cruise line, they were, especially back in March and April, there were cruise ships stranded all over the world with hundreds of people on them at sea for weeks, not sure what was going on. And a lot of those cruise lines, you could put Carnival in that group, failed to communicate with customers, with the public about what was going on and what the plan was to be able to bring their ships back to port and to get people back home. There was very little transparency in all of that. And I think those are mistakes. And I'm sure there are some similar mistakes you can even find if you look at the airlines. Those are mistakes that unfortunately undermined a lot of consumer trust in those brands, and it's going to be more difficult for them to recover in the future, even after the pandemic's over. Because what if I'm on a cruise 3 years from now and some other crisis happens, and if I don't have a lot of confidence in a cruise line's ability to be able to get me home despite that crisis, it might make me think twice about taking that cruise. It goes back to like, do I really trust them to take care of my life when my life is literally there? Like if you're flying an airplane, I should feel safe. One other question that has, and I think I was going to actually ask that, and it's a very valid question. Journalists sometimes make mistakes, or they publish something that later, especially at this time, it's not true anymore. So should a company or a brand delete a comment on social media, regardless if it was responded negative or not? Like, can we take back something because a lot of the times it's like once it's out there, it's out there. Somebody did a screenshot or something. We've been seeing that a lot with politicians. That happens with reporters. That happens with companies. So what is your take on that?
Well, number one, when you put something out there, it's out there. And you can update it, like you can amend an article online and you can post a correction on social media, but there are always going to be, screenshots or some backup on some server somewhere, the Wayback Machine. There are always going to be ways to access those archives, so that's something that you can't do anything about. And there are always going to be critics who try to troll you over that. But what you can do is making sure that, once you know that information is out of date, we'll say, amending the article, posting a correction to your social media, putting a note at the top of that article, an editor's note saying that, there's new information and the article was amended. If you're being transparent about that, I think that's what we want from journalists. It's a lot of unfortunately, there are a lot of blogs out there and some journalists that are less scrupulous about being transparent about those changes. But for the most part, I think journalists do it well. And it's about maintaining that transparency for when there's a change in the facts, making that update and putting it out there.
Yes, and doing genuinely, right? I think that's a big
genuineness
thing. Like actually, say what you mean and mean what you say is the best way to go about these things. Now, guys, just so you know, we have a few more minutes. So if you guys want to go ahead and ask more questions, because I only have a few more, I can ask around a lot, but ask away. This is an opportunity that we don't get that often. So it's a good moment for that. So I have a couple more questions for you that while they're writing their questions and whatnot. So the big question here is to be or not to be bold on making statements and positioning during times like this, because
Mhm.
it's almost like we know we should communicate as brands. We know that
Mhm.
being silent is not the way to go. So when communicating, I think a lot of the times brands fall, like they don't do fail because their statement is not strong. It's just like a blank, you know?
Yep.
So, or just more of the same. So the question is it a good moment to be bold when things are so chaotic and so
Mhm.
complicated? Or is
Yeah.
this a moment to stay safe and like,
Yeah. Well, the short answer is be bold. Because like we touched on earlier on, consumers in 2020, especially millennials and Gen Z, are craving that from brands, from the media. Purchasing decisions, for example, are being based increasingly more frequently on whether a brand aligns with your values and the causes that you believe in. And we've seen a pull away among consumers from brands that kind of stay neutral, which is different from the past. It's very different from the way that marketing was done 20 years ago. A good example of that's kind of well known would be back in, I think it was the 90s. Michael Jordan was asked by a reporter, why don't you speak up more about some of the big social issues, right? Why are you not more of an activist with your shoe brand? And his response was, well, because Republicans buy sneakers too. So that was the way that a lot of brands approached marketing back in the 90s and the 80s and before. It was kind of, remain neutral and don't offend anybody because everybody buys paper towels or everybody buys sneakers. But what we're seeing now is, especially among younger consumers, is they want to buy from companies that align with how they view the world and their values. So you have to be bold. But the way that you do that, of course, is, number one, you should focus on doing the right thing. Don't be bold just for the sake of being bold because you want to generate publicity or you want to be controversial. Focus on doing what's right and focus on being authentic to what your values are. And you'll find your tribe, your audience who wants to buy your product or consume your content if you're a reporter. But you want to make sure that if from a personal capacity as a personal brand, you're speaking up and you're standing up for what you believe in. As a reporter, of course, when you're reporting information, you still, the objectivity of it is important. But as a personal brand, people want to know what you stand for. And they want to associate with people who they feel share their values and stand up for their causes. When you're doing that, of course, like I mentioned earlier, just know that doing what's right is costly sometimes. You'll find your tribe, but you'll also find people who don't agree. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't always do permanent damage to your brand. And in today's market, oftentimes the cost of not taking any action or standing up for what's right, that cost is actually greater than standing up for what you believe in. So if you look at brands like Nike, they're doing a great job. Go ahead.
One thing to highlight as well, just to add to what you were saying, is that not necessarily being disliked and being hate can be bad for your brand. Look at the Kardashians. There are people that love following them and love them because they love to hate them. So that's a perfect example of like, not necessarily, to have a strong branding has to be based on they absolutely love me. A lot of the times it's like, I am so weird and so surreal that they hate me, but they like seeing what I'll come,
Yep. It's true. That's a strategy too. There are some brands that the Kardashians is one of them that have built a huge following on being controversial.
Yes.
That's a strategy decision that, you need to make to decide if that's the kind of identity that you want to create and if that's right for your business model. But it can be a very successful business model. But at the same time, you still want to make sure that what you're doing aligns with your values rather than just being controversial for controversy's sake. But yeah, I would say don't be afraid of controversy if you believe in what you're doing. And especially, because it's aligned with what your core market believes in, speak up for what's right and make sure that, as a brand or as a personality, a thought leader, that, you're trying to be the leader for your vertical in doing what's right and taking the right actions. And that goes a long way with cultivating relationships.
Now, do you think one thing that we see in as far as outlets and journalists is that all of a sudden you start having this separation, this polarization of people that lean more towards the left follow certain outlets and certain journalists, people that lean more towards the right. Do you think that that's something that's going to happen as well with brands and companies as a whole? Like, is something like if Coca-Cola puts themselves as like a more leftist company, will I, as a consumer who is more leftist, start buying Coca-Cola, and then Pepsi goes into the right, and then do you see that that's something that's going to happen naturally, or the products, like when we're talking about certain brands, like the product's still the product, and I'll drink Coca-Cola no matter what?
No, I think so. There's a much larger, broader cultural issue at play there, because as a society, obviously we're living in a very divisive time. It's a very polarized climate right now culturally. And the cycle of business kind of follows in step with that in 2020. So as long as society remains very divided and polarized, I don't see any reason why that wouldn't also carry over into who you buy from, right? If you look at Nike, who's taken, a really great stand on equality, and some of the things that they've done along the way have caused hashtags like boycott Nike on the right. And now I guess, you're mostly going to have Republicans who are buying Goya beans. So I don't see any reason why that trend wouldn't continue, because it's just the nature of the cultural climate that we live in right now, that people want to align themselves with the cause that they believe in all aspects of their life, whether it's buying products or consuming content or otherwise. It's correct that, people on the left are following their particular news outlets, and people on the right are following their news outlets that favor their view. You can say what you want to say about that from a cultural standpoint, whether that's good or bad for the future of the world, that, kind of people are only listening to their side that aligns with their beliefs, rather than kind of, a more balanced worldview and discussion. But as long as that does continue, I see that becomes a bigger trend in business and how people consume content and who they buy from. And I think you'll see more and more brands who embrace that as a result, because like I said before, the cost of staying silent is becoming much greater than the cost of standing up for what you think is right.
That makes perfect sense. So one thing that I was just thinking is, as journalists, I look at it as more as a personal brand, right? So with the politics, I get it, because people that cover hard news, they're going to end up having that type of polarization. But here there is a question that in the perspective of a personal brand, should companies or brands interact with haters or just ignore them? Because I think that when journalists, we publish something, and sometimes it's our opinion, haters are going to come and reach out to us. So how do we address that? Because for me, and that is a question that came from the chat from Joaquin, that's something that it's hard to decide. Should I address this? Should I not address this? Like, what would you recommend to, let's say, your clients, or,
Yeah. 90% of, the short answer is 90% of haters shouldn't be engaged with on social media. That there's nothing that you can really add to your brand or to your message that you're putting out there by getting into, kind of like comment wars and Twitter feuds with people. Most haters, you're entitled to your opinion. They're entitled to yours, to theirs. And a lot of times that hate, sometimes that backlash that it might fuel on social media actually can help your content reach more people, because of the way that social media's algorithms are built. Having that increased engagement on your content can expand your organic reach and get you in front of more people. But most of it, I would say, what we recommend to our clients is don't engage with it. There are some exceptions there, and it can become part of a strategy. If there's another brand who has an opposing view, and maybe you create some kind of like a debate style piece of content, where you can have a fair and not personal discussion about the different sides of the issue, Sometimes that works for certain brands. But for the most part, don't engage with haters. Continue creating content that's authentic. You'll find the people that it resonates with. And for everybody else who takes the time to comment on something to let you know that they don't like it, or that they don't like you, or whatever it might be, they're just helping get your content in front of more people. So I wouldn't necessarily worry about it. It's a good sign that you're getting attention. But as long as you're doing the right thing, keep doing that, and you'll find your tribe.
Now, I wanted to ask you just if you could give, because I know a lot of people here don't have experience with branding and like strategic communication. So if you can give a few do's and don'ts in branding and communication in the moment of constant uncertainty. I think you already said some of it, but I just wanted us to kind of organize, because I think one of the points is to be truthful to what you believe and what you want to pass. But, just like a little highlight. And guys, if you haven't, I am done with my questions. I can create more, but if you have any questions, this is the moment to ask, because we are almost done with the time. So ask away, write on the chat, and I'll make sure that he gets it.
Yeah, so at a high level, just takeaways, I would say, number one, like you just pointed out, authenticity. Figuring out what values you want to be a part of your brand's identity, personal or corporate, and make sure that you're communicating authentically in a way that's aligned with that. Number two would be proactiveness in your communication. Like we touched on earlier, under communicating, especially during a crisis, can do more damage to your brand than necessarily trying to figure out how to navigate the waters of how to communicate. So make sure you're being proactive in communicating. Another thing, I would say is listen more than you speak. Is something that I think a lot of brands could learn from. Learn to listen to what your followers are thinking and what they believe, and how you might be able to connect with them on a deeper level as a result of that. And that goes back to, again, not just putting out content that sells a product or sells content or tries to drive page views, focusing on putting out content that's truly valuable for people. And I think one of the ways that you do that is listening to what your audience cares about, and figuring out how you can create more content that's valuable in that respect. So listen more than you speak, provide value in the information that you're putting out, not just sales content. And then look for those causes that you think are most important to your audience based on listening to them, and figure out a way that you can take a meaningful stand on those issues, whether it's speaking out, whether it's taking certain actions to be able to actually contribute to the dialogue. Look at how you can take a stand on some of those causes, and maybe differentiate yourself from other people in your field who are kind of staying neutral, which, as we discussed before, is something that consumers and readers are really moving away from in 2020.
Now, Doreen is asking, does this all apply equally to political candidates' branding? Authenticity applies to everybody. Do the right thing, authenticity. Make sure that you're communicating content that's consistent with your values. It's all really important. Obviously, as a candidate, you want to make sure that you're or really as any brand, you want to make sure that when you're taking a stand on these issues, you're figuring out how to do it in a way that is eloquent and gets your point across properly. But yeah, this is the same, whether you're a candidate, whether you're a brand, whether you're a reporter, you need to be authentic, you need to be proactive. Unfortunately, not a lot of candidates listen more than they speak, but it's really beneficial for your brand if you do that, and focus on how you can provide value in the content that you're putting out. No, that is a very good point. I think listening to the audience, and that's what we always talk about, market research. And nowadays with social media, if you have a following, if you already have a following, it's so easy to find out what the audience wants from you. If you post and you open the dialogue. So do you find that nowadays it's more the interaction between the brand, or whether it's a company or a person, with their actual audience, like the fact that they can easily send you a message on a Twitter or on Instagram, Facebook, and get that response? Do you think that that's the reality that we're going to see from now on? Consumers, followers, like that.
Social media started it. It created a platform where consumers could interact directly with brands And as social media has evolved, we've seen that enhanced even more through, new platforms that are being created that allow even more direct personal content between brands and with consumers. And that's the key to, building a successful brand right now and likely for a long time into the future. The brands that do the best have found a way to create a face of the franchise is a good expression. They found a way to humanize their brand identity to their audience. And again, I would go back to Wendy's Twitter presence. They do this really well, finding a way that you can kind of, whether you're a corporate brand or a personal brand, create a personable, relatable identity around who you are and making sure that you're engaging directly with your consumers and having conversations with them rather than putting out marketing content. Is how you cultivate relationships and brand loyalty in 2020, especially with younger people.
Yeah, and now, when we used to talk about relationship between company or brand and consumer, it was something very it was a mute relationship. It was
a one-way street.
Yeah, and now when we talk about it's an actual relationship. You should be communicating, you should be responding, you should be liking their posts and stuff. So it's inevitable to talk about branding nowadays without the knowledge and the conscience of social media, really.
Yeah, well, if you look back 30 years ago, right, the marketing channels that were available to brands and also for consumers to consume were pretty narrow. You had TV, right, and you had a couple of major national newspapers and magazines, and number one, those aren't exactly interactive platforms to begin with. But those were really the only platforms. So brands would advertise there and consumers didn't have a lot of choices in terms of where they consume their content. But now through social media and blogs and through podcasts, there are unlimited places that consumers can get their content from. And so what they're craving, they're kind of in the driver's seat. What they're looking for from a brand is more important than what a brand is trying to put out. And you need to make sure that you're meeting consumers there and creating those opportunities for engagement and having dialogue and cultivating real personal relationships rather than just putting out advertising.
No, that's amazing. Well, I'm pretty done with the questions that I have prepared, and I've done a few more. Guys, if you don't have any more questions, Richard, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I certainly learned a lot. I updated a lot of my concepts of branding with this conversation. I hope that everybody is leaving this webinar with something new and something to work on. And, these were amazing advices and tips and perspectives that you brought. We really appreciate having you here at the Foreign Press Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in New York. And thank you all for participating and watching. This is going to be safe, so whoever missed or whoever wants to watch it on Facebook later is going to be available. Thank you so much, and
thank you.
We look forward to keeping this and maybe doing another one of this in the future.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you. I had a great time. Thanks for all the questions. And for anybody who would also like to continue the conversation, feel free to reach out. You can find me on social media.
I was going to ask, how do we find you? Yes.
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Richard Lorenzen. You can find me on Twitter at rlorenzen, or feel free to go to fifthavenuebrands.com and you can shoot us an email. But we're happy to continue the conversation with anybody who would like to learn more.
Yes, well, wonderful. Thank you so much. And if you guys didn't get the information, you can always write us and we'll send the information on how to find Richard, how to find us, how to find me, everything, whatever you guys want. We're all about connecting and giving useful information for journalists. So thank you so much. We look forward to another one of this. Thank you guys for joining. Join us for more of this. We have one at least almost every week. So we're really doing our best to maintain during the time of pandemic and social isolation to keep learning and keep developing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.